Oh, this is gonna be crazy. Alright, so hello everyone and welcome to another edition of SpraynPray1000's Verdict. I am SpraynPray1000 and today we're going to talk about the campaign of Starcraft 2 Legacy of the Void. And let's just hop right into it. So following up from what was actually one of the first, I believe the fifth verdict I've ever done, um, StarCraft 2 Legacy of the Void follows directly off of Heart of the Swarm, which was the last in the StarCraft 2 trilogy. And it follows Artanis, the hierarch of the Protoss, as he seeks to reclaim his fallen world of Ire. And in general, the campaign plays similarly to the previous two, Wings of Liberty and Heart of the Swarm. The general mission progression of both campaigns is, or well, actually at this point, all three campaigns is very similar. Typically, what happens is during the build up to the ultimate final conflict, you gain a new unit each mission or every so missions. And usually the mission in which you get that unit revolves around using that unit strategically to help you. You kind of learn how to mix it in with your army, use it to your advantage to help you defeat enemies and complete the optional objectives and stuff along those lines. And Legacy of the Void is no exception to this rule. Or most missions, you gain a new unit. You use said unit to help you defeat enemies and progress through the missions. Using that unit usually gives you a strategic advantage, and ultimately, in the final couple of missions, you use everything that you've learned kind of to your advantage, which gives you some free form. It allows you to decide what to do and what not to do. And in general, the last couple of missions are usually the most fun because of that. Um, like usual, the gameplay of StarCraft is isometric view, real-time strategy where you give orders to units, you divvy them up into groups, you strategically attack enemy emplacements and units. The kind of thing that you're used to now as the RTS genre has expanded. But StarCraft still has that nice tinge of doing it in a very nice and fun way that's also very fast-paced. So additionally, StarCraft 2 plays at a good speed. You can up the game speed, which is always good, and the unit diversity is always fun. And I really enjoyed mixing and matching different units together. And there's a few different ways that I typically like to play Protoss because it's my favorite race out of the three in StarCraft 2. And I really enjoyed that about this campaign. Now, let's talk about the negatives of this campaign. Despite the other two campaigns being very long, Legacy of the Void is actually pretty short in and of itself. Now, at the time of retail, there are basically three campaigns that make up the entirety of Legacy of the Void, which is referred to as Episode 3 of the story in game. There's the initial Zeratul campaign, which is called Whispers of Oblivion, which follows Zeratul after the events of Heart of the Swarm and leading up into Legacy of the Void, basically giving a little bit of backstory on stuff, and it's very vital to the story in and of itself. It runs on the Heart of the Swarm engine, though, which is because it was released prior to the release of Legacy of the Void. Um, has a pre-order bonus for people that ordered it off of not BlizzardNet, BattleNet, and now at this point it's available just to anyone who buys Legacy of the Void. They kind of guys like a little pre-order bonus ahead of time. Then you have the actual main meat, which is the Legacy of the Void campaign, which follows Artanis as he reclaims his homeworld of Ire, and he enlists the help of several different entities and several different groups to achieve that end. Um, Following that, you have the final campaign, which is Into the Void, which I won't really talk too much about, but just know that both Whispers of Oblivion and Into the Void are 3 missions each. And Legacy of the Void, in and of itself, is, I believe, only 17 missions, 19 missions maybe. And it's not very long. Out of all the campaigns, even when you slap on the bonus missions, this one I think is it either ties or it is the shortest. And just Legacy of the Void by itself is most certainly the shortest mission out of all of them. And part of the reason for that is kind of also mixed in with my analysis that I'm going to give for the story. So really, what I want to say about this game, unlike Wings of Liberty, which had a very mini campaign based style of story where you go to a planet, you sort of follow a couple different quest lines, and then you follow those quest lines to the end, usually involving some sort of player choice, which ultimately you find out really doesn't do much and add much to the story except for maybe the last mission. In Heart of the Swarm, you had a very strong narrative as you followed Kerrigan on her rise through power, which was very interesting on that quest of vengeance against Arcturus. This one really is just kind of not as good, which is not to say that it's bad by any means or even okay. It's just that the plot progression in this game is not nearly as good because it's just generally go here and get a unit and do something that kind of helps you. But ultimately, the plot development I feel isn't as well realized as the first 2 campaigns, which is disappointing because this campaign was kind of set up to be the most epic. It was kind of alluded to in the last 2 expansions, but not really touched on too much. Artanis was kind of just off doing his own thing, which kind of is a little disappointing, I feel. And because of that, the gameplay and the missions kind of suffer. Most arcs are only 2 to 3 missions, and there's really not that many different plot arcs in this game. It really kind of is only, I think, like 4 or 5, and they're all pretty short. And then that's just kind of it. Then you go to the main, and then you go to the end game. And I'm not sure if that's because the Whispers of Oblivion and the Into the Void campaigns were kind of trimmed away from it, but I just feel personally that the campaign, both on the story and the gameplay aspects, is kind of trimmed down from the last 2 stories and the last 2 expansions. Now that being said, the game itself does play really well, and I do like the diversity of the missions a bit more than some of the other ones. But the problem with that ends up being is just that the missions I feel kind of don't go anywhere. You might have a couple cool missions, and there might be certainly different things you can do. So one mission, for example, you might be holding off while using void rays to attack enemy units and fly around and stuff like that. Another mission might be purely about using ground units to your advantage. It might not be advantageous to bring stuff, but really the more of that is or most of that is just stuff that we've already done in other missions. So it's not that ridiculously new, but it is done in a way that I find is very fun and very interesting. But ultimately, the gameplay doesn't really get too complex. It feels pretty short, and it wraps itself up very nicely, but very quickly at that. On the flip of that, the story of this really doesn't progress from more than we're going to reclaim Ire. And that's basically the whole plot arc, and there are some character development moments between a couple other characters, which is nice. But ultimately, the story feels like it doesn't do too much. It doesn't go anywhere, unlike Kerrigan's story, and certainly unlike Wings of Liberty, which really had a few turning moments and a few different things, and especially the way that the way Wings of Liberty ended on a completely different note from whence it started. It just doesn't feel like it really wrapped up too differently, especially after you finish Into the Void, which is kind of a somewhat ambiguous ending. I mean, there's a few different ways I've seen people take it. The campaign of Legacy of the Void just feels like it was, I don't want to use the word safe because it certainly wasn't too safe, but it doesn't really do too much. It just kind of is what it is, and you know what it is by the time you've gotten a few missions into it. And while it is good, because I am kind of, going a little negative on it, it is good. Don't get me wrong, it is fulfilling. It just doesn't really branch out as greatly as the last 2 campaigns. But what I will say is that the character development, where there is some, is very good. There are a few twists in the story that are pretty good, which is very interesting. And certainly once you continue on to play Into the Void, which, by the way, is not an all-Protoss campaign. You actually do play as the other races in it. And it's sort of like a final test of your skill, one which I kind of flubbed my way through, more or less. it is pretty good, to see the way that the story wraps up. In some aspects, I feel the ending could have been a bit stronger given how much they built up this storyline over quite literally at this point almost 20 years. I feel they could have done a lot more in that regard, and that would have been something I would have liked to see improved. Um, Now, again, since this is a PC playthrough, again, the graphics and presentation are kind of dependent on your system, which mine was not that impressive, but nonetheless, it is still pretty good, even on the lower settings, which is something I've always liked about Blizzard, and their games. Especially back when I used to play WoW, and definitely when I was playing Heart of the Swarm, I could notice that. But mainly, I will say this: the gameplay is solid, and there's lots of fun stuff to do in StarCraft 2: Legacy of the Void. And while we'll have to see how the multiplayer balances out and evens out, it is definitely worth picking up, at least if you're a fan of the campaign, because it is just that good, and it has the same basics that made Heart of the Swarm and Wings of Liberty so lovable. It's the end to a great trilogy of storyline and character building, and while it's not the strongest embodiment of that, it certainly is a good one, and that's what's really important about this campaign, I feel. And I really hope that maybe someday later on we'll get something else from Blizzard along these lines, because I really like the way that they do their RTS campaigns. But until then, Legacy of the Void is a strong contender. It's a good holder, and I really had a lot of fun playing it. And ultimately, what would I give Legacy of the Void? I would probably say that Legacy of the Void, which I think a long time ago I talked about what I would have given Wings of Liberty. I gave Heart of the Swarm a 94 because I felt that the Kerrigan storyline was very gripping and very powerful. I think I hypothetically would have given Wings of Liberty a 90, although I forget. I don't remember exactly what I would have said. I'm going to give Legacy of the Void an 88 out of 100, simply because of the fact that it is a strong entry. It does do a lot of cool stuff, but the things that it does have been done better by the other two expansions, and that's really the main gripe I have. I feel that there could be way more of them. I feel that there could be a lot more stuff going on. Um, and the missions themselves don't feel, while the maps are fun to play on and they're very fun to do, I feel that the missions themselves aren't as complex per se, at least some of them, as the last couple of campaigns. But on the flip of that, I find that the missions are, as I said, more fun to play through and more interesting, and definitely with the unit diversity, there's a lot more stuff that you can do. And that's what's really fun about this campaign. I feel the story could have been paced a bit better. It could have had a few more twists, and because, again, the fact that the main campaign of the game is short really kind of detracts from the story. It doesn't really give them the necessary time to develop more arcs and more plot turns. Um, and that's kind of what all my gripes about. Otherwise, it's a very quality RTS product. I think that a lot of people will like it. If you're looking to jump into it, or if you're just a veteran, obviously you're probably going to really like it. But yeah, so that's going to be it for my StarCraft 2 Legacy of the Void verdict. I thank you, and we'll see what comes up next, and I will see you then.